It's good to be here in beautiful France. It is the other side of the world. I can attest to that. But it's a very long journey, and so I'm suffering a little from the length of the journey. So forgive me. But look, it's great to be here. So I will bring, hopefully, a different perspective coming from the other side of the world. And I'm going to begin with a phrase that is used quite often in China, and this phrase is, "The sky is changing." That is really how it feels, right, everywhere in the world at the moment. There are such huge seismic disruptions occurring on every level that we can think about. And this is something that China, I would argue, is central to each of them. So firstly, we have the return of multipolarity for the first time in a long time. We are entering a new multipolar world. And China, as currently the largest economic power in almost every measure, and certainly the second largest power on some measures, is absolutely central to that new multipolarity. So we need to understand how China is going to act in a new world in which it is one of the great powers. This is quite challenging for the West, and it's very easy to catastrophize it and to imagine that this is the absolute end of the world. And since 2017, when Donald Trump declared that China was a strategic competitor, and the narrative switched in the West from a narrative of working with China and welcoming China into globalization, the narrative for now 8 years has been that China is a threat. China is, in a sense, we don't use the word enemy, but it seems the European Union uses the word rival, right? Strategic rival, adversary, and all of the adjectives that we see in the Western media. At least, forgive me, I'm only able to read the English language media and literature, but in the English language, the adjectives that occur before China are usually aggressive, threatening. So there's a normative bias that suddenly occurred 8 years ago in 2017 when the President of the United States made that decision, because prior to that, it certainly was not the case. I'm happy to explore that a little bit more. But it's not just about multipolarity, it's also about a big economic shift that is occurring in the world, and that's related. It's related to the rise of China, of course, is the globalization era and the shift in the world economy to Asia has also, I think, in my analysis, has also been catastrophized in this part of the West, put it that way, the Atlantic West. Certainly not catastrophized in my part of the world. Australia could be imagined to be part of the West on almost any measure, and yet Australians have benefited enormously from the rise of China and from the rise of Asia. So for Australians, actually, the economic changes are very positive. The results of globalisation have been enormously positive for people throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And so it's relative. It depends on what part of the world you're in, because in the United States and in Europe, where I would argue there have been some domestic political decisions taken to not remain as competitive in the global economy as they could have, in particular the deindustrialisation of the United States, which is entirely down to United States decisions, but is now blamed on this enemy. It's now blamed on China, front and square. And then related to the question of economic change is also, of course, the technological revolution that we're in, and what Carl Schwab calls the fourth industrial revolution. This technological change, I think for young members of the audience is well understood, but I think for those of us who've been around a bit longer, it's perhaps hard for us to get our heads around how the new technologies of AI and high-speed internet and quantum computing, virtual reality, etc., how they're going to change not just the economy, but actually probably societies, probably politics. Everything is changing as a result of technology. And again, guess what? China is at the centre of this. So again, Chinese technology, the fact that Chinese technologies in some of those areas are leading the world is again imagined, especially in the United States, because the United States has been such a successful tech power China is now seen as a serious threat to United States technological leadership. And of course, the final one is the one that we kind of always forget about in these discussions about geopolitics and international relations. But I can tell you, coming from the Pacific Ocean, we don't forget about it, and that is the climate crisis that we're in. This is so serious, it's almost so serious that we can't even talk about it because, again, it's been catastrophised, right? We hear such catastrophic narratives about climate change that most of us switch off. Most of us cannot cope with the likely outcome if we continue on the track that we're on at the moment. The United Nations panel of climate scientists estimate that we're on course for a 3% increase in global warming this century. So that's the end of cities on the Pacific Rim. That's the end of my home city, Sydney. It's gone. It's the end of Bangladesh. It's the end of a lot of the world. So we can't actually cope with that. That's so catastrophised that we just don't really talk about it, right? We just put it in the back drawer and imagine that it's not part of international relations and geopolitics, but it sure is. It sure is. Once countries start disappearing, as some of the little Pacific Island countries already are, that's going to be the new geopolitics. And guess what? China, again, is at the centre of this. It is China that is developing the new renewable energy technologies, the electric vehicles, etc., which again are being catastrophised in the West as a threat, as an economic threat or a technological threat. Actually, they're the solution. We actually need the whole world, not just China, to be investing in switching to renewable energy and green transport, green infrastructure, and all of the other measures that will decrease our impact on the environment. The Chinese get that because they absolutely destroyed their environment in their growth surge of the last 40 years. And they also get that it is the technological solution to the next stage of the economy, because when they master, as they look like they have, when they master the cost curves of producing new technologies, it means that they can then master the mass scale production at very low cost of the new products and services of the new economy. Once your power is virtually free, once you've invested in the infrastructure and then you're running everything for free, it reduces the cost of everything and creates enormous innovation. So I think we can expect that China is on course to lead the technological revolution, and this terrifies the United States in particular. But so on each of those areas, I would argue that we need to step back a bit from the catastrophising. We need to step back from the discussion as if this is all a threat and it's all something that we just must stop. We must ban Chinese companies. We must build up our ability to confront and to contain China. All of this is the symptom of old thinking, and we are in a totally unprecedented era. Now, firstly, when it comes to multipolarity, we're in a completely unprecedented era because China is not a European power, it is not the United States, it is not Japan. It has a cultural particularity. It has its own civilization, just as India, another rising power, has as well. These are totally different civilizations. So if we look at China through Western eyes, and in particular analysts who sit in Washington or Brussels or London or anywhere else, if they're imagining that China is going to act like the European powers of the 19th century or like the United States or the Soviet Union or Japan of the 20th, they're completely missing the point. China will act like China. Now, that isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, by the way, because we can make all kinds of judgments about how China will act, and I think if you were a neighbour of China, you might be very cautious about how China will act. But China will act in its interests. And there is no narrative in China, as there was in Europe, or as there was in the United States or the Soviet Union, about dominating the world. There is absolutely no narrative about that. The Chinese don't believe they possibly could, because they don't believe that one civilization can govern another civilization. And they're quite right. European attempts to colonise the world failed dismally. The United States and the Soviet Union failed as well, even though the United States was a much softer approach to colonialism. But China has no illusions about how colonialism fails. It drains you of your capabilities. It absolutely creates dysfunction on the ground and resentment and anger, and ends up creating enemies. You end up with the terrorists, you end up with the insurgencies against you. China doesn't want that. China's terrified of insurgencies within its own borders, and it's terrified of the instability in places on its borders, like Myanmar. But there is no grand plan sitting in a back shelf somewhere in Beijing to dominate the world. But this is totally incomprehensible to the West. The West imagines that, of course, China's going to act just like we have acted in the past. I think it's highly unlikely. What is, however, very evident is that China will use its economic power to have a role in the world that will no doubt be described as a leadership role in the international economy. There's no doubt that China, and China, by the way, Chinese analysts, government and others and businesses are well aware that there is a push in the West to isolate China and to contain China. And so China is extremely busy and very strategic about building its relationships with the developing world. And the developing world is the vast majority of the world. And globalisation, the extension of markets and connectivity to international markets for developing countries has changed the economic model. It's no longer a colonial model. You can now be Bangladesh. You can be one of the poorest countries on earth, and you can supply the clothing to the world. Bangladesh is now the second biggest producer of clothing in the world. And that means that you can transform your economy. You can create employment. You can create urbanisation. If you introduce education and infrastructure, as China and as other East Asian countries have done so successfully. Japan is a model. Singapore is a model. Hong Kong and Taiwan, of course, were models. South Korea, a very successful model of how you can develop by using an approach that links you to the international economy, embraces globalisation. How unfashionable is that to say in Europe or America? But the successful economies of the world, the successful growing economies of the world are the ones that have embraced globalisation, have taken their competitive advantage and they've invested in it. And they've invested in a state-led model of the state having a strategy, the state working with business, the state investing in infrastructure. And so you see this huge network of railways and ports, airports, broadband infrastructure, Wi-Fi infrastructure that China is rolling out across the developing world. So the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, as it's called, the New Silk Road, has 170 members. Now that's not something small, that's almost the entire world. We saw before the slide of the United Nations membership. What's the United Nations at now? About 200 members. Well, 170 of those are working with China to develop what Chinese call the Belt and Road. This is an investment in the new phase of globalisation, in new trade routes. And those trade routes, you can be sure they're going to avoid countries that try and contain China. So if countries in the West start to put sanctions onto China, try to block trade and investment with China, China will simply now switch to other suppliers, to other markets. It's building its capacity in Africa to replace Australia. It's entirely relied on Australia for its resources in this growth phase of the last 40 years. The iron ore, the coal, the uranium, the lithium, the natural gas from Australia has fueled China's rise. But since Australia a few years ago decided that it would repeat some of the Trump narrative and provoked China, China just closed down a whole lot of trade with Australia. It, of course, didn't close down the trade it needed, such as iron ore and lithium, but China has been very busy developing its alternate sources. And there is no doubt that in a decade or so, China will not need countries like Australia. It will be entirely integrated with the developing world economies. And it has a vision, and it's a very compelling vision in the developing world, just as the American vision was very compelling to many of us in the 20th century about freedom and democracy. The Chinese vision is one about development. It's about economic development and non-interference. And this is rhetoric, perhaps. Let's hope that they live up to this rhetoric. We know that the United States hasn't always lived up to its rhetoric, so perhaps we shouldn't expect the Chinese will live up to their rhetoric either. But their rhetoric is very clear that they believe in the diversity of civilizations, They do not believe in imposing their view or their civilization on others, and they believe deeply in non-intervention. It's not surprising, because those are the principles of India, that India and China together brought to the Bandung Conference in 1957, and they've been the principles of the non-aligned movement all that time. But in the Cold War, we kind of forgot about the non-aligned movement, and they were so unimportant economically that it was easy to miss them. But today, what I'm suggesting is that the economic importance of the developing world is that it is a much larger portion of the world than the West. It is a much larger portion of the world, and that portion of the world is developing. And if they can be, if countries across the developing world can be as successful as East Asia, and that's a big if, because there are cultural differences, and maybe the East Asian model of development is not replicable. However, I think we're seeing South Asia develop, and we're seeing many other parts of the developing world as well, developing their own models. And they're looking to China in a positive light, not as an enemy, not as a rival, not as an adversary. So we have a very interesting dilemma here. If we paint China as an enemy, and if we continue on the course of trying to isolate them and block them, I think the reality is we will fail. And I think this is what I would say to the United States, which has long been Australia's security guarantor and long a cultural friend of Australia. But when the United States says, we need you to confront China, we're going to need to have one day a war with China, I say to my friends in the United States, you are mad. You are mad if you want a war with China, because China is the rising power. And if you want a war with China on Chinese territory, or in the region that China considers to be its territory, we all know what I'm talking about there. If we want a war with China where they will have the force of nationalism, legitimacy amongst the developing world, and where they will fight to the end to defend what they consider to be their own homeland, we really think we can win that? The United States couldn't succeed in Vietnam against nationalism. It couldn't succeed in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Does the United States really think it can take on China? So I think we've got to be thinking, all of us, about alternatives. We've got to be thinking, if we take a political risk approach to this, and I'll wind up here, we actually ought to be looking at the scenarios for what happens if we take specific strategies. If we take this strategy of creating China as an enemy, we're going to end up in a conflict. China may not even find that unwelcome. China may actually find it quite welcome to have that conflict, because they'll win it. It'll be the end of the United States' supremacy in the Pacific, and it will reshape the world. So I don't think any of us actually do want that conflict. So I think we've got to be looking at what are the other scenarios, and are there scenarios where, just as we have very successfully in East Asia, integrate all these economies so that they are deeply economically interdependent, where they have habits of dialogue, where we have overlapping regional organisations, like Kynes mentioned the OSCE in Europe. We have a whole series of overlapping institutions that embed dialogue and respect and non-intervention in East Asia. These are the deep values of the region. So there is an alternative, but it's just that it may be an Asia-led alternative. It may be the kind of alternative that you'll read of from academics from Singapore, not from Washington. But it's worth thinking about, because the alternative is simply not sustainable. Thank you.